Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to our first student-led lecture series event of the fall 2023 semester. I am very excited to welcome our special guest speaker, Sarah Gamble. Sarah Gamble is an architect and educator with a passion for the public realm and community projects. Her research and project experience extends in affordable housing, disaster relief, historic preservation, and community design. She is an assistant professor at the University of Florida, where she is the director of a certificate community design. She co-authored Environmental Activism by Design, written alongside Coleman Coker. This book delves into the intersection of architecture and environmental activism, offering profound insights into how design can play a pivotal role in shaping sustainable and resilient communities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gamble.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction and for having me today. It's my first time to Virginia Tech. I really enjoyed looking around, meeting the students, seeing your beautiful building, and the way that you all are working, especially the design work for the first couple of weeks of school. So it looks like you're off to a great start. Let me hook this on here. Okay. Is that working? Mm-hmm. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about a responsibility to place. And I want to first kind of enter into the discussion with an analogy for you. So in 2015, writer Mandy Lee Catron published an article in the New York Times titled, "To Fall in Love with Anything or Anyone, Do This." The piece made famous a 1995 psychology study on human closeness that flipped the notions of human connection, assuming that love is an action. So following the original study, the author suggests asking a friend, an acquaintance, or a partner 36 scripted questions before staring into each other's eyes longingly for 4 minutes. She claims the intimacy and the vulnerability that the exercise creates leads you to greater familiarity and trust. And as we know from personal experience, all relationships begin with this get to know you phase. Whether you're getting acquainted with a new friend, a place, or an architectural project. And I think lucky for us all, this 36 scripted questions has been turned into an app that you can all access through the New York Times. I encourage you to check it out. So when we think about architectural education and practice, we enter into relationships with our clients, with our contexts, and with our projects themselves, often engaging with the hope of producing a built work for a very particular place. This way of working, it tells us a lot about how we enter into and conduct this beginning phase of the design process. How do we get to know the parties involved, their priorities, and their availability? When successfully undertaken, this phase centers on curiosity, open-ended questions, on-the-ground research, really kind of diving in, getting our hands dirty. We listen deeply, we hopefully avoid judgments, and we focus on the needs of others in efforts to successfully understand people in place. So these discoveries in the process spark greater curiosity and leave us wanting to know more. So as we, and I say us as design professionals, also as kind of citizens of the world, as we rally around to respond in efforts to the climate crisis, right? We're dealing with issues and challenges at a magnitude that we have never faced before. We can follow and this get to know you kind of approach, following this simple idea. Looking to place for inspiration offers a simple yet profound way forward. And this getting to know you phase, the social, the cultural, the historical, the geographical, the kind of human-centered, the people, right? This is really a focus of my work, especially the public, right? And how we bring people into the fold, into the world of architecture, and kind of teach them more about what we do, what architecture and urban design can offer to society, kind of educate, but also collaborate along the way. So this looking to place, right? It's very easy to do in these natural, kind of beautiful settings, but we can't overlook the fact that we must also look to the industrial, the dirty, right? The places maybe that have been damaged or desecrated. Those are just as valuable guides for us to continue and to think about how we will move forward, how we will respond as design professionals. So many of these ideas underlie a new book that I published with Coleman Coker, who's a professor of practice at the University of Texas at Austin. This has been a kind of 5-year book project underway, and I am going to speak to many of the themes and the research from that book today, and conclude with presenting my proposal or my call to action for how we as design professionals can respond. And I'm going to use a couple of projects from my own practice that are set within urban conditions. Most of the lecture I'm going to talk about kind of coastal, almost rural conditions, to kind of exemplify the proposal and some points that you all might consider. But in the end, my focus today is really on place. How do we get familiar with it? How do we learn about it? How do we observe intentionally? And we can think about that, those 36 scripted questions as our kind of analogy for how do we engage? So the book itself captures lots of research. It captures 8 completed design build projects in a very detailed way. In addition to many chapters that kind of capture the program that I'm going to talk about today. But before I delve too deeply, I want to give you a bit of background about how the project originated. So Coleman and I met in 2006 when we were both working in New Orleans doing Hurricane Katrina relief. We were both working at Tulane. Coleman was teaching design studios focused on sustainable, affordable housing in the city. You can see one example here titled Green Build. I was coordinating a consortium of 17 national and international universities that were bringing New Orleans-based projects into their design studios and assisting in the rebuilding process through student and faculty engagement. Now, fast forward to 2012, and Coleman and I again became colleagues working at UT Austin at the School of Architecture. I taught there until 2018, and this is where Coleman still teaches today. Upon his arrival, Coleman began a new program called the Gulf Coast Design Lab, and it's really the focus of the book. The program itself has been operating for over 10 years. It's got about 30 completed built works. And the big idea for the program, and I'm going to quote Coleman here, is that once we begin to know our environment, we will want to nurture and protect it. Okay, so that simple idea really underlies the program and the way that he structures each studio. So these are design build projects, and I want to pause for those that may not be familiar with that term. This is a popular model for architectural design students, where students are challenged to realize a design through the construction. The model from design through to construction, sometimes in one semester. In this case, that's true. At other schools, it might be multiple semesters. This model emphasizes collaboration, and in the end, building one project together. So oftentimes the parameters of design build studios dictate the size and the scale of the projects. In this case, Coleman only takes on projects that can be completed in one semester. And working and getting familiar with the place is incredibly important, and I'm gonna talk a bit about how they do that today. So as I'm flipping through some of these images, I wanna also pause and talk a bit about sustainability. One of the underlying kind of observations, or I would say critiques, that both Coleman and I experienced in kind of Hurricane Katrina times, but also in the field in general, is a critique of how the field of architecture has approached sustainability over time. I think we can all agree that being sustainably minded is incredibly important, and getting educated on how we integrate sustainable features and materials and approaches into our design work is essential to moving forward in this kind of present time. But they cannot come at the cost of environmental education and knowing places. So I want to reference here Tom Fisher's writing. He is the former dean of the University of Minnesota School of Architecture, and he is a thought leader within public interest design. He's also a very well-published author. In his writing, he highlights how our lack of knowledge has led us to address environmental issues superficially. And when I say us, I mean the architecture world. That we often address it under the guise of sustainability rather than examining the root causes of damage and neglect that plague our natural environment. This realization points toward environmental education as a necessary precursor and complement to the profession's focus on sustainability. So I would just pause there and say, I think if we just go into some available continuing education online opportunities or resources that architects kind of take part in every year, it's very easy to find training about sustainability or maybe LEED certification. It's very difficult to find training about environmental education in the way that it might apply to the design process. And so I think over time, we as architects have had the tendency to add things. Let's add some solar panels, let's add some green materials, right, to increase the sustainability. And those things are all very well and good, right? But we also need to kind of step back for a moment, especially in the place that we find ourselves, and try to examine the root causes of what might be causing some of these problems and kind of take ownership of how we might be contributing as a profession, right? And I speak to that not from an expert on technical sustainability or even an expert in environmental justice or education, but just from like the perspective of an architect, right? And just kind of noticing what's going on, right? And we can't leave it up to the scientists and the technicians, right, to solve our climate crisis. It's to such the magnitude, right, that we all have to find new and different ways to contribute. And that's really one of the underlying ideas of the book, is that how do we optimistically respond? So again, to put it plainly, and I'm going to quote Coleman here, once we begin to know our environment, we will want to nurture and protect it. This premise underpins the work of the Gulf Coast Design Lab and posits that a cultivated respect for our environment will transform our personal practices, fueling advocacy and activism through the architectural design process and the work that it shapes. So the images you're seeing here, these are example projects that have been completed over the past 10 years. These are all photographs taken either by Coleman or by his students. And that is what really is, kind of permeates the book. There's really over 200 images to view and to really understand the documentation. And this is something that was incredibly important to me in terms of really diagnosing and documenting the process and how the design lab sets up a model for both practice and for teaching, right? This is something in Katrina relief times that we didn't have time to do, and we really kind of lamented the fact that things were so fast-paced, we were moving so quickly that we really were dealing with some innovative ways of kind of engaging disaster relief, but we didn't have time to document them fully. And so this, I think, is a step forward in responding to a particular issue. So as I said, this research project, Coleman and I have been collaborating for about 5 years, something that began with a very small article, kind of blew up into this extended project. And as a researcher, I really aimed to understand and to document the process, the work, to create a model that you or I could go out tomorrow and replicate. And much of the work is interviews, is talking with students who had participated in the program. So I interviewed and surveyed many of the alumni, also met with clients. And one of our goals was to embed the voices of the participants into the publication. And so we did that. Here you can see a quote, and you'll notice there's an action verb for each project. That's the title. That's the kind of their approach. They give an action as the name of the project, of what they were trying to what they were intending, part of that design intention. So you can see those quotations kind of embedded within the body of the text, but also these call outs. So it's really clear like who's speaking, who's contributing. Also, these interviews gave Coleman and I the opportunity to kind of look back on work that had been completed, in many cases, over 5 years ago. And so taking a step back, kind of pushing back a bit, we could really get a sense of the impact on the students' lives, right? Asking students, you can just kind of put yourself in those shoes. If the professor comes back to you in 5 years and asks you, what did you learn in this studio? How did it impact your practice today? What are the lessons that you took forward, right? It was really inspiring to hear what the students had to say about the process. And many of them could give really concrete examples of how they have brought it into their practice today. Okay, so I want to switch gears for a minute and talk through 2 of the 8 projects that are highlighted, and this is Float. So Float is located in Sea Rim State Park, and I'm giving you a map here for those that might not be familiar with Texas. Let's see if I can get there we go. See up here, number 6, Sea Rim State Park is over here, very close to the Louisiana border, so top right-hand corner up there. Okay, it's quite an isolated state park, but it's well-traveled by Texans. So the park itself is kind of spread along over 5 miles of Texas coastline, and 4,000 acres of the park are wetlands. So the idea for a floating campsite emerged in an initial conversation between Coleman and the superintendent at the time. The superintendent really wanted to find ways to make the park more accessible to the public, and that 4,000 acres of wetlands, you can imagine, is pretty difficult to access for the general public. And so the idea of this floating campsite posed one of few, and I'm gonna put quote unquote, backcountry campsite opportunities within the Texas Park Service. Oftentimes those campsites are car parking, right? You can drive your car right up, plug into the utilities that are available, set up your tent. But this is one option that would truly be backcountry. This is located a 60-minute kayak trip from the shore, okay? So you're really invested. And this can be booked today. You all could go online and rent this for a weekend getaway. Stay on the campsite, bring your tent. It's a really beautiful spot. So as with each studio, when the project begins, they focus on research for the first several weeks, and that involves visiting the site, often multiple times. And you can see in the map that Austin is quite a distance from the coastline. So it's a minimum 3-hour drive from UT Austin's campus over to the coast, right? So it's really an investment on both the faculty and the students' part to move back and forth between these places throughout the semester. So there's a lot of logistics involved, you can imagine. So they spend time with the stakeholders, in this case, Texas Parks and Wildlife staff, learning, understanding how the park is being used, understanding the parameters, especially maintenance, understanding how they hope that the public will rent it and use it moving forward. And the studio begins with students having individual design responses, right? And then over time, the students form small groups, and then bigger groups, and then bigger, right? And then eventually one team, right? So throughout the first half of the semester, they're working through the research and those design iterations to kind of finally, as a group, have one design that they're all in support of moving forward. They go through several design iterations and presentations with the client and get approval to move forward. Okay. And then at that point, about the halfway point, they begin the construction document phase. So they begin, creating drawings that they can all follow to complete the construction. And at the same time, they're working through fabrication. And at UT Austin, there's a big tent set up outside the School of Architecture, and that's where they work. They are out there welding, cutting, prefabricating pieces so that when they get to the site, the assembly or the construction is quite abbreviated because remember, they live in Austin and these sites are very far away. So they're having to move back and forth. So a typical project, they might spend like 3 weekends in order to complete the assembly on site. They're doing a lot of it on campus. Over the summer, in like a 6-week summer studio, they might spend 10 days, continuous days on site to build it. So you can see here in this example of float, the students began with the platform, right? They assembled all of the pieces, they got the floats underneath, and that then became their work surface, right? And is a limited space, so they're having to kind of negotiate who's doing what when, and the ones that aren't working are on alligator patrol, right? They're in their kayaks, they're watching what's going on, they're monitoring, right, that alligators aren't coming nearby, right? Something maybe that you might not be familiar with here in Virginia, but is a common occurrence where I live in Florida, as well as Texas. This wetland space is about 4 feet deep. You can see here the woman in the blue jacket. It's above her waist, but it's standable, right? They could kind of work. And so one of the big parameters was getting everything from the shore to the site. They had to think about how they were gonna package and kind of put it on a flat bottom boat that wouldn't weigh the boat down so much that it would drag, right? So they had to very carefully think about the components, the weights, the pieces, getting everything out there, and then the way they would assemble it. So they did have to do some on-site welding, kind of putting pieces and parts together, and eventually, they tip up the tower all together, and they kind of complete the installation and then lower the concrete anchors to keep it in place, okay? I think one, and I'm gonna actually go back to images here. One thing that is, the tower acts as a wayfinding device within this kind of water landscape. So you can imagine being a kayaker And about 30 minutes in, you spot the tower and you know where you're headed, okay? It also references the petrochemical industry and the stacks, right? They're kind of odd constructions that are in the distance of Port Arthur. It's kind of on the nearby coast. So they're referencing kind of architectural, it's also acting like signage, but it's also containing the restroom. And so one of the requirements is that you leave no trace. Okay, so within this tower is a 5-gallon bucket, and that's where you would use to go to the restroom, and then you take the bucket back with you to the shoreline when you depart with the rest of your trash. Okay, this project holds 2 tents, so for 4 people, and you can see in the image down here, you see the steel rails kind of moving along the edge of the platform. That's to keep the gators off, right? That's to keep them from kind of moving up onto the platform. That was another big kind of worry of the project, and it has proven to work. The gators are not sunning on here. This was completed 2017, I think, and so it really has stood the test of time in the past couple of years, even having been hit by a hurricane. Following Hurricane Harvey, the float was dragged about a mile into the nearby wildlife refuge. And fortunately, the refuge had big equipment that they could pick it up and help put it back in its place. No damage whatsoever, it just got moved, right? So that's a success story. Okay, let me go on to the next project, which is Inhabit. This project is located at Galveston Island State Park, and it's number 10 on my list here. Let's see, which is down here, so it's in this lower bubble, and you can see up here on the map. So it's within about a 45-minute drive of Houston, and again, here's Austin way over here, and San Antonio. Okay. So Galveston Island is a really popular spot for people from Houston. It's a good place to go to the beach, okay? And much of the Texas coastline is occupied by petrochemical and other industry. That's something that you might not realize. So there are kind of pockets of places that are either untouched or have like a beachy coastline that you might go visit. Much of it also is kind of rough coastline. So at Galveston Island State Park, this is a popular place for people to come for the beach. But the park also has a series of well-attended environmental education programs, and one of them is a walking tour. Okay, so the environmental educators will lead visitors through the park in a loop, and they really needed an anchor spot. They needed somewhere they could say, come meet me for the tour, right? A place to sit and a place to be out of the shade. This is also a park where they get a lot of school groups from Houston, especially elementary school students from inner city neighborhoods that might not have access to natural spaces. And so this is a great outlet for them on the school field trip. They can all move down to the coast together. It's a short distance and really kind of experience it firsthand. And one of the primary requirements that the environmental educators communicated was meeting the basic needs of the visitors, especially with the younger students. They had found over time that if their needs weren't met, they wouldn't pay attention, or they couldn't get them to kind of think beyond the here and now, that they were hot or they were hungry, right? They needed them to kind of free up some mental space to begin to even delve into these ideas about environmental education or protection, sea level rise, etc. So again, the students spent much time on the site, getting really familiar with the park. They went through an iterative design process first individually and then collaboratively. They got the approval from the client, which again was the state park system and their staff. And they went into fabrication. So you can see them in the tent here that I was talking about, all the tools set up in this kind of temporary workspace. And then they began to move onto the site to assemble it. Now, this was a summer project, so they had a more continuous time on site to build. Another detail that I would add is that all of these designs must satisfy hurricane strength winds. And so the students are often collaborating with a structural engineer to design kind of the frame, right? And to make sure that the pieces and parts can be assembled in a way that they'll be long lasting, but also kind of survive these extreme events. Many of the parts are hot dipped. They're galvanized so that they can withstand the humidity and the rain that happens here. So in thinking a bit about how you might experience the space, you can imagine yourself moving from a nearby parking area, or maybe you're moving on foot from another part of the park. You're moving along this gabion wall, right? And then you're moving up an accessible ramp, kind of along the edge here. You'd come to a screen, a horizontal screen, and then you'd turn the corner and you'd get this beautiful view of the water, okay? So the gabion itself is full of recycled concrete chunks or pieces that were left over from another project within the park. And you can see this kind of screened overhead with the 45-degree angle wood pieces. This was a really committed group in terms of welding. They had to weld each tab individually, right, on each of these overhead elements to get those, to get the screen in place. So quite a bit of repetitive work, right? And this created a space for, you can imagine a school group here, kind of sitting in the shaded area, sitting along the edge or maybe on the bench. The teachers are up there, and they're listening to the environmental educator talking about the environment. And they're likely starting here, they're going on their walking tour, and then they're coming back for a debrief. So these are really two of my favorite projects from their collection of 30 or so. But I would encourage you to take a look at their other projects as well. You can easily find them on the website or within the book. And if you just Google Gulf Coast Design Lab, you'll find those. They have quite a few. It's really well documented. Okay. So both Coleman and I, from the process of working together, right, from all the years of the studios, but also from my kind of researcher perspective, the interviews, the documentation, really engaging in the work. We each formulated a call to action or a proposal in our own way within the book. And this is mine. I've outlined it for you here in 7 basic points. So I want to give you a second to just read through this yourself. And then I'm going to talk more in depth about 3 of the points within this list. Okay. I do want to pause before I go on to these 3 points that I'm going to talk more at length and mention something about our role as architects. I visited the pro practice class this morning, and this is something that came up, right? Oftentimes, when we leave architecture school, we have this thought that architects are designers, which we are, right? We're great problem solvers. We apply our design skills to the world of architecture. But I think you'll find, and I have found, that I often find myself in different roles, not being the designer, but doing other things, right? I can bring my design knowledge and my expertise, but I'm often a researcher, a facilitator, an advocate, a curator, an artist, an educator, or an author, right? And I think I have found great reward in playing these other roles and not moving into it with the great expectation of I must be the architect if I'm gonna work on this project. And when I say architect, I mean the lead designer, right? There are so many ways that we can all contribute to projects. And I put this magazine cover up as an example to say that this is when I felt like I had arrived. I made it onto a magazine cover next to a shirtless guy with a troll hat, right? If you can find me right here, right? I mean, it's a little humorous, right, this guy? And, you know, I have found that oftentimes when I'm asked my opinion or I'm recognized for some sort of work, it's not for architectural design in the traditional sense. It's more related to one of these other roles and my impact, right? How I can bring lessons from architecture school, from architectural practice, into the fold or into some other part of culture or society or things that are going on, right? That might be policy, it might be advocacy. So I kind of put that out there to say that I would encourage you all to be open, right, to other opportunities that might present themselves along with architectural design. I love architecture school and I love to design, but I also put great value in these other roles. So with this in mind, I want to talk about 3 of the points in my proposal and just briefly share 3 projects from my own practice that try to exemplify these points in action within the world. And these are 3 community engagement projects. So for those that might not be familiar with the concept of community engagement, that's a process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people affiliated by geographic proximity, interest, or situation, and the issues affecting the well-being of these people, right? So the community engagement process is often a requirement for public realm projects or things kind of dictated by a government entity. It's also very popular within even kind of private business or in other contexts. Okay, so and one more clarification, community engagement is often part of the initial phase of the design process, that pre-design phase that's kind of leading us into schematic design. But in many cases, it gets roped back in at later points in the process, so we're getting continual feedback and engagement with whoever the stakeholders are. Okay, so my first point here is to take time to notice and observe. And I'm sure that's something that you have been working on in studio, regardless of the site or the level at which you're in the process of your education. But learning to look really intentionally and also listen is a learned skill. It's not something that comes naturally to most of us. It's something that really takes a lot of practice. And we need a variety of tools to do this as designers. And right now, I have been exploring walking as a tool for the design process over the past several years. And I have been working through, kind of in an academic way, literature reviews and research to try to identify walks the way other creatives have applied walking within their process, and how they have used it to engage place, how they've used it to become more familiar with the places that they are working. And I have diagnosed that these walks fall within 5 categories: wandering, measuring time and distance, engaging the physical environment, engaging the senses, and engaging others. And number 5 is incredibly important to me in that I have found that walking is something that we can all do together, right? Often in community engagement, you move to some faraway place and you're asking the public questions about a future design project. But why don't we just go there and look together, right? Look at the environment, walk the site, try to engage in the place, right? And we can set up exercises or we can facilitate the ways that we might look together. And then we all have a shared understanding of the place, right? Or at least as much as we can in engaging together, while we recognize that people, like the stakeholders or those that use the space on a regular basis, are experts, right? They have expert knowledge about the place. And we need to find ways to access that knowledge in order to bring it into our design work. So I really began looking at walking with students, using it for context analysis. And my prescription was that the students would design a walk that could be replicated by others. And they would have to create a 24 by 36 drawing that was black and white, that they used visuals or drawing to communicate the walk. There were no words involved. And then we would trade. I would give you my walk, you'd give me your walk, and we'd go into downtown Austin and try to do them, right? So you can imagine the challenge of communicating solely visually, of where to turn or look, right, or pause. But the research has really kind of redirected toward identifying and adapting walks, both for us to use as a tool, but also for us to engage with the community and bring people together. So I'll just show you a couple of visual examples. I've been, within those 5 categories, I've written about 20 walks. It's a scripted or text-based instructions that gives some background, gives a step-by-step instruction, and then it gives you a creative exercise to use all together. And I've been testing them with my architecture students. So these are 3 drawings produced from a walk that I call the Radius Walk, in that I asked the students to walk 15 minutes in one direction, to pause, and then to walk back and create and to capture the experience of that walk. And it's related to this idea of the 15-minute city, and that we would all have all of our amenities or necessities within a 15-minute walking radius of where we live or work. But it gets really interesting when you start to give the same assignment to non-architecture majors, right? And you see the way that they start to look at the world, right? From a very different perspective. So here we can see left and right, architecture major, non-architecture major, right? Same assignment. And it begins to tell me about community engagement, right? And the way that we as designers have to begin to try to understand the client, understand the stakeholder in a new and different way, in a more in-depth way, to try to really tap into their expertise and bring their feedback into the fold. So I'm working through the process of kind of diagnosing this in a much more technical way, collaborating. And this summer, I was fortunate to buy what is called a short story dispenser. This is a piece of equipment manufactured by Short Edition, a French company, that their goal is to get creative writing or short literature into the hands of the public for free. And so these are all around the world, especially in Europe. You find them a lot in the States and university libraries, where you go up to and you hit the button and it's like a ticker tape of text pops out. So I was able to customize the equipment to distribute my walks. And so you can see the dispenser set up in our student union here. And we dispensed about 650 walks in 6 weeks. So students from all across campus, different majors, came and took part in the project. So this work continues, and I'm building toward a book containing case studies, containing the walks themselves, in order to become a guide or a tool for you and I, the practitioners, right? That walking could be an asset to us in our work. Okay. The second point from the proposal is building up your intuitive knowledge. And when I think about that intuitive knowledge, one of the analogies that comes to my mind is the work of Joseph Albers and his writing. If you can think back to the interaction of color, might be something maybe you tackled in your foundation studio. I saw some Joseph Albers books around today. In his writings, he's really focused on the interaction of color or the way the environment impacts our perception of color. He's not looking at it from a technical perspective, like what is the wavelength and how does it touch my eye and what's the behavior of the eye, right? It's really more, he's trying to train our gut instincts around color. And he calls it the eye for color. So for me, I think that is a really helpful analogy in thinking about how we can learn about place. And I think it also applies maybe to the sense of maybe a rainfall, right? We can go straight to rain data to try to understand it, but feeling rain on the site, the smells, the sounds, the sensory experience, is something that we just can't get from technical research. Right? So when I talk about that intuitive knowledge, I'm thinking maybe in the community engagement sense about storytelling, right? And actually, if I go back to this previous image, I was hired and collaborated with my partner at the time, Lynn Osgood, to design an engagement process to talk with users of Town Lake Trail in downtown Austin. This is like Central Park of the city of Austin. It's a big loop that moves around what they call a lake. It's really a dammed portion of the Colorado River. But it's really the primary recreation point for everyone. And so the Trail Foundation wanted to celebrate how locals were using the trail, but also plan for some future improvements and find ways to pull information from them about these improvements, many of which were bathrooms, so kind of unsexy, things that they just needed to get done, right? So we designed a 36-foot-long timeline and installed it on the trail, asking passersby to pause and to share a story with us, to intersect the story in the timeline of the trail's history. And we kind of embedded the timeline with kind of anecdotes and photographs of history. And we asked them to kind of put their story where it intersected on the timeline. So we got stories from throughout its history. And within a week, we had 1,700 stories. We filled the front, and it was 36 feet long, and we moved on to the back, okay? So it told me that people were really, really willing to share information about a place that was so important to them. And this information, we literally typed up every story that was on the board. We went through that process, created a spreadsheet, and the stories were shared with the architects of these future projects. And it also they ended every monthly newsletter of the Trail Foundation moving forward with a story, right? So these as a collection tell us a lot about how the trail is used tells us about the place itself and really how people feel about it, right? This isn't really technical knowledge, right? This is more kind of gut instinct, qualitative knowledge that we can gather. Now, we did dissect the stories a bit, trying to create categories and understand use through that kind of mechanism. This on-site, in-person project was kind of complemented by an online survey, right? So you can imagine it went through a series of very technical questions like, when do you come to the trail? Who do you come with? How do you use the trail? How would you use a restroom? How would you use a bike rack, right? You can imagine these basic questions. And we had it open for several weeks, and we're pulling teeth to get 500 responses, right? So to me, it's a comparative study, right? People want to participate in a way that's creative and it engages their kind of personal opinion. We're all tired of those online survey question kind of things, right? And we need to find new ways to engage people in place. Okay. The next point is being open to collaboration. And I'm sure you've heard in many of your courses that collaboration is key to architecture, and for sure it is. And we are trained to a certain extent to engage with engineers or other built environment professionals. But we have the possibility to bring others to the table, folks that we might have overlooked in the past and might have expert knowledge that they can bring to our projects. So, for example, the bird watcher, right? Maybe the naturalist. Others that have maybe been on the site and understand it better than we might. A project that I use as an example, in 2015, in collaboration with Legg Lewis Legg, which is a public art group, myself and my business partner at the time, Lynn Osgood, were commissioned by the city of Calgary to take on the largest community cultural development public art commission that had been seen in the country of Canada up to that point. So it was a really large-scale commission, and it was tied to the completion of a new light rail station. So I give you the map of Calgary here, and the last stop on the red line is the Tuscany station. And so in Calgary, as well as many of our communities here in the States, when you do a large-scale public improvement, part of the money has to be allocated to public art. And that public art is usually physical, and it's either sited within the location or nearby, maybe the neighborhood, but it's somehow tied back to the project. And so we were hired to engage the neighborhoods around the Tuscany station and come forward with a built work that would tie back to the station itself. And in Canada, this is really a term we don't use much in the States, but community cultural development really means making with the public, right? Making in collaboration with the public. So we traveled to Calgary many times to engage the physical environment. It's an incredibly suburban area. It has amazing natural resources, but it's been developed in a very suburban way. So you'll find pockets of the natural mixed into these kind of McMansion feeling neighborhoods. It's a bit surreal. The closest thing I can kind of compare it to is maybe Colorado Springs, if you've been there before. We also took the opportunity to meet with the community, attending kind of public events, trying to get their input before we began the design process. And in the end, we did design a built work, but the Transportation Authority, who is the funder or the primary sponsor of the public art project, decided in the end that they weren't interested in a built work due to liability reasons, and asked us to move forward with a community engagement process. So we commissioned and collaborated with 5 local Calgary artists to design a series of excursions that we could then take the public on. We can invite them to. And one of the underlying kind of impetuses for these excursions is that we would make together, right? That during the excursions we would be making, okay? And I show you just a couple of images from one excursion that was focused on the Red Line itself. And so the public was invited to join us on the trip. We collaborated with a local Calgary artist who had done a lot of sketching work with the public. And so the process essentially, it provided the participants with clear clipboards and kind of overhead projector kind of film. You know, it's kind of clear, you can draw on it like a transparency. And we would all get onto the Red Line together and we would begin to move through the city. And at each stop, we would ask them to do a drawing, not by looking and drawing, but by holding up and drawing through the transparency, okay? And so as they captured these moments, all of them were contributed to a collaborative drawing that was composed of the different sketches. And as we moved through the city, we collaborated with a local historian who shared information about the place we were in, about when the development had happened, what was going on in the city at the time, and how all of the information kind of came together in relating what they were hearing and what they were seeing in terms of the development patterns related to transportation. And the outcome, again, was that collaborative drawing, but also this kind of document that now sits in all of the public facilities, public libraries in the neighborhood that can be referenced, right? It's what documented or kind of captured this community engagement experience with the public. Okay, so as I conclude, I just want to encourage you all in your work, in studio, whether you're a faculty, whether you're a student, to continue to seek out opportunities for environmental education and to kind of roll them into what you're doing. I think in many cases, this environment may be the natural, but it might be the industrial or the ugly, right? But looking to those places as a guide, I think is a really a valuable approach to our work. And I'm gonna leave it here, so thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for your insightful lecture. It was a wonderful discussion. I am now opening it to the audience for any questions.
And yes, I'd love to answer questions. I would also offer that I've got, if you want to take a look through the other design build projects, I have some copies of the book up here. If you want to subvert Amazon, I also have some copies that you could purchase today. And we'll take questions from the audience, but I'm happy to stick around in the lobby too to keep talking with folks.
Again, thank you so much. My question is, do you think it's at all possible to understand or to embody place without having a connection to it, like from sort of like an out-of-body and out-of-place experience?
Well, that's a good question. And when you say you're unfamiliar with it, do you mean kind of in the context of studio that you might have visited once and you don't have a personal connection? Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question and a potential constant problem in architecture, right? That we get accused of kind of parachuting into a place that we might not know very well. And here we're being asked to maybe design something that's incredibly permanent or long lasting. and we're doing it without a lot of on-the-ground knowledge or intimate knowledge of the place. And so I think that goes back to expertise and maybe tools, right? We got to find ways to tap into those local experts, because I think it's true, unless you're designing something in a place that you personally live and you're personally invested in, right, you're never going to have as in-depth a knowledge as someone that lives there, or maybe someone who works there, right? You've got to find ways to access those people and ask them their opinions and capture it in a way that either you're acting as a translator to other designers, or maybe you're the designer yourself and you have to find a way to kind of absorb it and respond to it. But I think it's going to be a constant challenge, right? Yeah. Huh. Well, yes. You know, that's interesting. I'm a Floridian. I guess I'm technically from the geographic South, but I don't know if I'm from the cultural South. It is a challenge, right, when we think about climate deniers, or maybe people that haven't come to fully accept climate change is on our doorstep, right? It's already impacting us. And I think, you know, it's very easy for us all, I mean, and I put myself in this category, to just kind of sit back and let other people try to deal with it, because it's really challenging to figure out what to do, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think in Florida, at least, our politics aren't as wrapped up in the environment as other issues, I would say. But that's probably not the case in other places. Maybe in Texas, for example, where the petrochemical energy and oil money is very impactful. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How should us as designers, for our ideas care about the environment, which people how should us as architects or future architects respond?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, how do we, and if we put ourselves in the shoe of like the intern, right, or maybe someone newer to a firm, you know, how do we try to contribute or maybe affect change within a project, especially when money is the driving force? You know, one example might be asking the principal to have extra site visits, like physically spending more time on site, or maybe asking an expert from like a local environmental educator to come visit the firm and to talk about the landscape. Or, you know, I'm assuming it's a greenfield site. It might be a brownfield site, right? So you might need some, you know, maybe some industrial or, you know, environmental justice related expert. But I do think that we have to begin with incremental change or small change so that we can kind of build toward it. So advocating for environmental issues. I know if you've worked in a firm, lunch and learns are always something that happens. You know, when the firm asks you, well, who should we bring for the lunch and learn? Don't invite the vinyl flooring guy, right? Invite the, someone from city government that's working in the local environment, or, invite others. And they're not going to give you those continuing education credits, but like we got to start somewhere in trying to kind of change the dialogue, especially in the firm. And I would say all this with the caveat, we're all in architecture programs that have that are overseen by these national organizations that kind of regulate the curriculum and what we learn and have all these requirements, right? So we often don't have time in our curriculums to say have a whole class focus on environmental education. So we're going to have to find ways to embed it into what we already do, right? And Coleman and the Gulf Coast Design Lab is a great model for how to do that. How do you bring it into the studio? How do you integrate it into what you're already doing and show that there are these other factors that are just as important as aesthetics or material or space making, right? They have a really big impact on the land and the landscape and the stakeholders. So I kind of talked around your question, but I hope, does that kind of, any follow-up? Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, we got another one. Oh, wonder if the battery died. There you go.
Hello. Okay. When you're talking about these principles of community engagement, of like intuitive knowledge and just like observing and like being engaged with your space, do you more see those as like tools for the designer, or do you think that it's also the place of architects to try to, through the built environment, promote those values in like the communities that you're working with?
I would say both and, right? I mean, I think that's one of our most valuable skills is learning how to intentionally look and gather information from the environment. And I think we all know, we've maybe talked with our family or, maybe folks outside the world of architecture, and the things we talk about seem like so like left field to them, right? And I think one of those is being so aware of our physical environment. And so how do we bring the public, like how do we advocate for change or positive impact by just pointing out to them something that's not working and saying, we could do this better, right? We could change the sidewalk to allow this to happen or that to happen, right? Like these, and maybe showing them that it's not as difficult as they think, right? That the built environment could really contribute. Yeah? Okay. Yeah?
you.
Okay. Thank you all.